If we restrict ourselves to disasters alone, we omit all the wild tales that will make you queasy, regardless of whether they end in tragedy or not. There will be more stories for me to cover, and their endings are unpredictable, increasing the tension. As always, viewers should exercise caution, but I hope you enjoy today's stories. The Canadian Rocky Mountains, which begin at the border between British Columbia and Montana and continue south of the Yukon Territory, are a part of the Rocky Mountains in North America. They are about 1,500 kilometers, 932.1 miles, long in total. They cover a total area of 200,000 square kilometers, 124,274.2 square miles, with a width of about 200 kilometers, 124.2 miles. This implies that the Canadian Rockies would circle Florida and spill into Georgia to the north. Due to their northern location, they receive substantially more permanent ice and snow, even though they aren't quite as tall as their southern relatives. Because of the many glaciers that have carved their way through the Canadian Rockies, they now look considerably more rugged. In contrast, the American Rockies are much more gently contoured. A prime example of this is the famous route connecting Banff and Jasper National Parks, which runs along the Alberta-British Columbia boundary. Throughout this region, the highway passes directly through mountain ranges, with the rugged peaks towering on either side of the road. On this section of road, early on April 1st, 1983, two men, James, 28, and Richard, 33, were climbing a mountain called Deltaform, the highest point in the Valley of 10 Peaks. This mountain stands at 11,234 feet and 3,424.12 meters and embodies the classic, sheer ruggedness of the Canadian Rockies. That morning, they set out from their valley camp and hiked for around 2 kilometers, 1.24 miles, to the base of their ascent. The mountains were still covered in heavy snow and ice, as winter in this region lasts until early April. Using ice tools, they began climbing an ice couloir, a steep gully that had formed between two rocky sections. They ascended the ice with the aid of a rope, securing it with ice screws. As Richard lowered one of his tools, a shard of ice broke off and struck James. His cry alerted Richard, and they both watched as the shard tumbled down the mountain. However, just as the ice chunk broke free, a terrifying sound sent chills through them, the unmistakable roar of an avalanche. Within seconds, the men were swept off their feet and carried down the mountainside by a torrent of snow, plummeting through the 2,000-foot. Sometime later, James awoke, completely disoriented, unsure of where he was or what had happened. Unfortunately, his injuries were severe. His back was fractured in 2 places. His arm was broken. For a brief moment, he thought he was in a different mountain range, one he had visited months earlier. But gradually, he began to recall where he was and what he had been doing. Then it hit him. He had been with Richard the whole time. But now, he had no idea where his friend was, or whether he had survived. Summoning what little strength he had left, James forced himself to stand. Nearby, he spotted Richard. Unfortunately, his injuries made it clear. Richard had not survived. Realizing the extent of his own injuries, James collapsed beside his friend. He was convinced he wouldn't make it. For a while, he lay there shivering, but soon, an overwhelming warmth and exhaustion set in, a sensation he recognized as the first sign of impending death. Then, out of nowhere, he felt a presence. A voice spoke to him, urging him to keep going. It told him that the least he could do was try. With renewed determination, James rose and began the long, painful journey back to camp. Over the next several hours, the voice continued to guide him, offering encouragement and practical advice. At one point, it instructed him to use his own blood to draw arrows in the snow, markings that could help rescuers find him. Step by step, James pushed forward, though every movement was agony. At times, his injuries forced him to crawl. Yet, throughout it all, the voice never left his side, hovering over his right shoulder, directing his every move. Finally, after an excruciating struggle, he reached camp. The 2-kilometer journey had taken nearly an entire day. Upon returning to camp, he was unable to even get into his sleeping bag. His injuries were so severe that he couldn't do anything, not even light his stove, let alone eat. By that point, the afternoon had already begun to turn dark. The frigid night would surely kill him. Exhausted and in agony, he assumed this was the end. Then, he had the distinct impression that he heard additional voices instructing him to make a distress signal. James called out for rescue, claiming he had been caught in an avalanche. Regrettably, the voice that had been guiding him vanished, along with the other voices. He reasoned that the wife must have realized how hopeless his situation was and had abandoned him to die. However, shortly afterward, a skier suddenly arrived at his camp. They were the only other person in the region, and they had overheard his cries for help. Now that he had been saved, James understood. The voice had not abandoned him. This experience is known as the third man factor, or third man syndrome, referring to what James perceived as an external presence guiding him. The famed explorer Sir Ernest Shackleton was the first to record this phenomenon in modern times. In his 1919 book, South, Shackleton described feeling as if an unseen entity accompanied him on the final leg of his Antarctic expedition. Notable mountaineers Reinhold Messner, Peter Hillary, and Anne Bancroft have also encountered this phenomenon. As far as anyone can tell, this is a common experience among lone sailors, climbers, and polar explorers facing extreme danger. According to modern psychologists, the third man effect is a survival mechanism, a way for the mind to cope with extreme stress in life-threatening situations. James firmly believes he wouldn't have survived without it, though he has never experienced it again. The great epics and disasters from the 8,000-meter summits have been on my wish list ever since I began covering mountain climbing stories on this channel. These stories are as daunting as the mountains themselves, which is why I have been putting them off. A great deal of background information is required to understand the challenges that many climbers have faced, similar to technical cave diving. Factors like weather conditions, climbing techniques, massive amounts of gear, and month-long expeditions all play a role. Not only do I enjoy discussing these elements, but I also believe most of my audience finds them fascinating. Because this is such an enormous undertaking, I have postponed it, despite my strong desire to do these stories justice. However, the next subject serves as a great introduction to these challenges and the dangers climbers face on the highest peaks in the world. I don't expect to cover everything, but it should serve as an excellent starting point. This is the story of Rainbow Valley. Since mountain climbing has grown in popularity, it is only natural for climbers to seek greater heights and more challenging routes. As the tallest mountain on Earth, Mount Everest represents the pinnacle of this pursuit. It has been climbed more than any other peak, over 8,000 meters, an achievement recognized even by those outside the climbing community. Despite Everest's relatively low fatality rate, its popularity has resulted in a greater number of deaths. In fact, Mount Everest has the highest total number of fatalities of any 8,000-meter peak, even though it is not the most dangerous. This explains why the mountain has seen 3 times as many deaths as any other peak in this elite group. While Everest's rising popularity has drawn significant attention, one overlooked aspect is the sheer volume of gear that must be carried to the various camps along the route. Due to the immense size of these mountains and the time required to ascend them, climbers must progress in phases. As a result, mountaineers establish multiple camps at different elevations, allowing them to rest, acclimate, and gradually work their way toward the summit. The higher a climber ascends, the more difficult the journey becomes. The air grows thinner, the temperature drops, and permanent ice and snow become more prevalent. At 26,000 feet, 7,924 meters, climbers typically set up their final camp before making their summit push. This altitude, 8,000 meters, is just below the infamous death zone. Only the world's 8,000-meter peaks extend into this death zone, where oxygen levels become insufficient to sustain human life. At sea level, the human body functions efficiently because the air is dense enough for red blood cells to absorb adequate oxygen. However, above 8,000 meters, oxygen levels are so low that cellular respiration slows to a near halt. In the death zone, you are, quite literally, slowly dying. Your body can adjust to an extent. When exposed to low oxygen levels for extended periods, it compensates by producing more red blood cells. This approach, however, has its limitations. 8,000 meters is the mark. On top of that, adaptation takes time. For these physiological changes to occur, you usually need to spend at least a few days, if not weeks, at high altitude. Without proper acclimatization, you risk developing life-threatening conditions like cerebral edema, altitude sickness, and pulmonary edema, all of which can be as deadly as the climb itself. This is just one of the many difficulties mountaineers face. Beyond the extreme physical challenge of the climb itself, they must also contend with bitter cold, high winds, avalanches, rock falls, and unpredictable weather. Because of these dangers, the world's highest peaks have come to symbolize the ultimate achievement in mountaineering. At the same time, these extreme conditions make bringing supplies, or anything else, down the mountain incredibly difficult, often to the point of being impractical. This includes the bodies of fallen climbers. Rainbow Valley lies beneath Mount Everest's northern ridge. Its name derived from the multicolored corpses scattered across the area. When climbers perish on Everest, their brightly colored jackets remain untouched. Over time, these bodies accumulate, creating a multicolored cemetery visible to all who attempt the ascent. Some of these remains are recent, while others date back decades, even to Everest's earliest expeditions. In fact, over 200 bodies are scattered above 8,000 meters on Everest alone. For comparison, the world's second highest peak, K2, holds the second highest number of deaths among the 8,000-meter peaks, yet its toll is only 81 climbers. The reason these bodies remain on the mountain is simple. Retrieval is nearly impossible. Helicopters cannot operate at such altitudes, meaning recovery teams must physically remove bodies by hand, a dangerous and costly process that exceeds $70,000 per body. Even then, recovery is not guaranteed. In many cases, conditions make retrieval efforts completely impractical. As a result, some of these bodies have become landmarks for climbers navigating the mountain. One of the most infamous examples is Green Boots. This body, believed to be Tsewang Paljor, a climber who perished in 1996, rests inside a small cave near the summit. Many take breaks there, sitting alongside Green Boots, who remains silent as they pass. Researchers have identified some of the bodies scattered across Everest, but many remain nameless. Most of these climbers likely perished from exhaustion, cold, or illness, dying alone, unable to call for help. At such altitudes, there is little anyone can do. Stopping to assist someone in distress often means risking one's own life. Tragically, climbers must often continue forward, leaving fallen mountaineers behind. Due to Everest's extreme cold, bodies do not decompose quickly. Many will remain frozen in place indefinitely, unless a new, safer method of retrieval is developed. To some, mountains mean nothing. Some see them as merely beautiful landscapes, stunning, yet meaningless. Others, however, see a challenge. They dream of standing atop the world, pushing their limits in pursuit of the ultimate feat. Then there are those who seek out mountains so extreme that they require specialized skills, equipment, and unwavering determination. For some, the greatest joy lies in scaling snow-covered peaks, while for others it is the sheer thrill of the descent, carving through fresh powder on skis or a snowboard. As with all things in life, there exists a spectrum of interest, ability, and courage. Some people are simply born with an innate drive to push themselves beyond their limits, to master their craft, no matter the risk. One such person was Marco Siffredi. Marco Siffredi was born on May 22, 1979, in Chamonix, France, a town at the foot of the Mont Blanc Massif, one of the birthplaces of modern alpinism. Unlike most aspiring mountaineers, Marco didn't have to travel to find adventure. It was right outside his front door. Growing up in this legendary alpine region, he was deeply inspired by the culture and history of mountaineering. His ambition was evident from an early age. At just 16 years old, Marco Siffredi snowboarded down the Mallory Couloir, a notoriously steep, exposed 1,000-meter slope on the north face of Aiguille du Midi. This couloir features a 55-degree incline, littered with jagged rocks. For perspective, the steepest angle at which snow can naturally settle is around 75 degrees. Even for non-experts, this gives a sense of just how extreme this descent was. While modern elite mountaineers attempt slopes in the low to mid-60s, Marco, a teenager, was already tackling 55-degree descents. He quickly followed this by descending Aiguille du Chardonnay and several other treacherous slopes for the first time in history. These feats demanded exceptional skill, courage, and unwavering dedication, qualities that defined Marco Siffredi. Then, in the fall of 1998, he took things to the next level. At just 19 years old, he successfully climbed and snowboarded down Toclaraju, a 6,000-meter peak in Peru. There has been only one previous descent of Mont Blanc on Aiguille Verte, which he accomplished in 1999. The average steepness of this very difficult course is 55 degrees, and there are spots where it reaches 60 degrees. He was already widely considered to be one of the world's top extreme snowboarders before this finish. However, Marco's ambition led him to want to keep pushing boundaries. The Nepalese Dorje Lakpa, which stands at 7,000 meters, 23,000 feet, was his subsequent major undertaking. He would also be able to descend this peak without incident. But first, from the peak, he could see Mount Everest, which was 1,000 meters higher. At that point, Everest began to appear on his horizon. He wasted no time in getting plans in motion upon his return from Nepal. Cho Oyu, the easier peak, would be his first ascent. He may learn more about his body's reaction to the death zone by climbing this mountain, one of 14 8,000-meter summits in the Himalayas. Clearly, before contemplating climbing the highest mountain on Earth, he needed to test his abilities on something similar. Then, in the autumn of 2000, Marco managed to reach the peak of Cho Oyu, which is 8,188 meters, 26,864 feet in height, and then snowboarded down from there. After his amazing feat of reaching the peak and then snowboarding down, Marco felt prepared to take on the world's highest peak. Interestingly, another snowboarder and alpinist named Stefan Gatt had plans to do the same thing in the spring of 2001, when our expedition was just getting underway. However, Stefan had other plans than Marco and intended to climb the peak without the help of Sherpas and extra oxygen. This is far more difficult and has been achieved by very few mountaineers. It was Marco's intention to snowboard down the Hornbein Couloir. In his opinion, this was the snowboarding equivalent of the Holy Grail. Upon his arrival, however, he discovered that the path in question did not have sufficient snow. Surprisingly, this made the mountain climb much easier, but it also ruined his snowboarding route. The Norton Couloir, an alternative locale, was thus his choice. It snowed enough on their ascent of the mountain that this path appeared feasible. Stefan reached the peak a day ahead of Marco's scheduled arrival. He continued snowboarding to an altitude of 8,600 meters, 28,215 feet, as per his original intention. However, he reached a particularly treacherous patch of snow and descended the steepest part for another 100 meters or so. He then managed to snowboard the rest of the way. Marco also reached the peak the next day. After that, he began to descend by grabbing onto his board. A legend, he snowboarded into advanced base camp 4 hours later. It was a genuine continuous descent of the tallest mountain on Earth. Thus, many people credited Marco, even though Stefan had done it before. Marco returned to base camp the following year, in 2002, with the intention of snowboarding his originally planned route. This time, he arrived during the fall, when a much thicker layer of snow covered the peak. Marco and his crew of Sherpas reached the peak of Everest for a second time at 2:10 p.m. on September 8th. Rather than feeling excited about reaching the peak, Marco was utterly exhausted. Marco took a few moments to settle down and collect himself before getting his gear ready to descend. Just a few hours down the road, the Sherpas reached Camp 3 and saw what appeared to be a man getting to his feet and sliding down the mountain, some 1,300 meters, 4,265 feet below them. However, upon arriving at that location, they discovered that no traces existed. When they arrived at the designated meeting place, Marco was nowhere in sight. Actually, nobody ever saw Marco again, and no one has ever located his body. Either he had fallen or an avalanche had taken him away. However, it's highly probable that we will never know for sure. Was his destination on September 7th?